Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, in this episode, I intend to discuss the 28th iteration of the Conference of the Parties, or COP28, that just ended in Dubai, UAE. A Conference of the Parties refers to the meeting between governments, and so they are referred to as the parties, who have promised to act on climate change. COP28 President Sultan Al-Jaber called the deal historic, right, but added that its true success would be in its implementation. And I'm quoting from what he has said: "We are what we do, not what we say," he told the crowded plenary at the summit. It's a bit ironic, and we're going to discuss that, but let's just get to the rest of it. And then he said, "We must take the steps necessary to turn this agreement into tangible actions," unquote. Now, earlier during the summit, Mr. Al-Jaber had claimed there was no science indicating that a phase out of fossil fuels is needed to restrict global heating to 1.5 Celsius. The Guardian and the Center for Climate Reporting actually reported this. And the Guardian's report read, and again, I'm quoting from that, Al-Jaber also said a phase out of fossil fuels would not allow sustainable development unless you want to take the world back into caves. Mr. Al-Jaber's comments were described by scientists as incredibly concerning and verging on climate denial. They were also at odds with the position of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. The criticism caused Mr. Al-Jaber to say that he had been misquoted, though reports suggest that he made the comments to questions from Mary Robinson, the chair of the Elders Group and a former UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. And this was during a live online event on 21st November. Mr. Al-Jaber is also the chief executive of the UAE's state oil company, ADNOC, which, according to many observers, they see as a serious conflict of interest. Two issues, among others, stood out at COP28: phasing out fossil fuels and loss and damage fund. On both, critics say COP28 is a cop-out. For instance, despite push from over 100 states for a clear timetable on phasing out fossil fuels, the final outcome was to begin reducing global consumption of fossil fuels to avert the worst of climate change. Now, proponents say this is a win because it signals the eventual end of the oil age, and eventual is obviously the operative term here. Whereas the critics, like the lead negotiator for the Alliance of Small Island States, Anne Rasmussen, said the deal was unambitious. And she said, and I again quote from what she said, "We made an incremental advancement over business as usual, when what we really need is an exponential step change in our actions." Ditto for loss and damage fund, which has put no money on the table except pledges of some $400 million. Now, the UN reports estimate the fund would need some $400 billion annually. A green climate fund that was first proposed at the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen and began raising money in 2014 hasn't come close to its goal of $100 billion annually. So that's the kind of background, but let's pull in the experts and dive right into it. I'm joined by Dr. Erum Sattar, teaches water security and policy, environmental law and water law and development, and currently is a researcher based in Cambridge. That's Cambridge, Mass. I also have with me Dr. Ilhan Niaz, professor of history at Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad, and author most recently of Downfall, Lessons for Our Final Century, a book about the climate gray rhino that's headed our way. So let's get to it, starting with Erum Sattar. Erum, what are the takeaways? I mean, is the glass half full? Is it half empty? Is it half empty and leaking? What is it?
So I'm an optimist by nature, and I am somebody who is willfully optimistic. Ilhan talks a lot about this in his book. So he's the expert on giving you the psychology of this. But I am a willful optimist even in the face of an impending disaster. Now, I take this position in a very aware way, and I think that's the only response that allows us to act with the urgency that we must. I think with this COP, what I've seen is that I am an optimistic person, and I am an optimist about its outcomes. It has achieved some key sustainable things. For the first time, it has put climate and health on the table, which was absolutely essential. There were, in fact, hundreds of people with sort of like a medical background who were talking about the impacts of climate change on health. Absolutely vitally important. And very importantly for Pakistan in particular is that it put agriculture, resilient food systems in the context of climate change also on the table. And it said that by next COP and the one after that, but in 2025, is where we have to sort of include agriculture in our climate commitments. So it is actually broadening out the parameters of what we must work on. And to my mind, that is very healthy because it goes just beyond emissions reduction and whether the language fight is about we must phase out fossil fuels or we must phase them down. Because I think that it's not all about carbon. So we saw this about the methane pledge, also very healthy. But for me, food systems resiliency, health, as well as like the urban resiliency that was put on the table are very positive outcomes.
Okay. I'm going to return to you, Erum, with, asking about the specifics here. But let me first go to Ilhan to get his take. So we have begun with optimism, slash, as you say in your book, pan-glossism. And so Erum doesn't think that COP28 was entirely a cop-out. Let's see what you have to say about this, Ilhan.
I think we're going to end with optimism as well. So The first thing is that the sheer farce of having an oil executive essentially in charge of running COP28. That's very interesting because oil companies going back to the 1960s and 70s actually developed fairly good predictive models of what's going to happen once the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere reaches various points. And based upon their projections from the 1960s and 70s, we are well on track for a mid-21st century collapse. In this respect, I think that basically the entire COP process is an exercise in delay, an exercise in diffusing responsibility, and an exercise in essentially allowing governing elites to prolong their current obsession with economic growth and all of that other stuff, which is leading us nowhere. So when you think about, let's say, agricultural sustainability or other such things, though I'm obviously not an agricultural scientist, I have studied enough about biology and earth science to know that if the earth is 3 degrees Celsius hotter by the end of this century, there's no agriculture on that type of earth. It's certainly nothing that can feed 9-10 billion people. So we have a situation where this whole exercise, I fear, is captured by the very people who are responsible for the problem that we are facing. And it in many ways reflects the intractable nature of the problem that we are facing. That how do you basically convince people whose very existence, whose very power, whose very profitability depend upon prolonging this business as usual model for another quarter after that, another quarter after that, to basically do things that will dramatically reduce their income, that will dramatically reduce their global influence. So that is the situation that was basically on display at COP. The same elites that, as you mentioned in your introduction, pledged 400 million to deal with loss and damage have absolutely no problem with sanctioning tens upon billions of dollars for wars in the Ukraine and now in Israel and Palestine. So the money is there, But the problem is that we have basically outgrown, in the material sense, our capacity to make sound decisions. And that disconnect between what we are able to think and what we are able to commit to in the moral and political and psychological sense, and our ability to essentially destroy the environment upon which we all depend, that was on display at COP. On a lighter note, I'm told that at COP, they had very nice lunches and dinners available for hundreds of dirhams per plate for the global elite that had jetted there on their private aircraft to solve climate change. And we know from one data point after another that it is precisely the rich that are driving us to destruction, that the inequality that affects greenhouse gas emissions is so painfully obvious. And we expect that those people are going to actually cut their own emissions, and they're not going to do it. But of course, the fact is that I'm also an optimist in the sense that I do firmly believe that greenhouse gas emissions will drop close to zero by the end of this century. But they will do so as a result of a catastrophic implosion of our ability to physically continue with this growth.
So you're being optimistic about the day after. So
exactly. So if
when
you see
we'll
the goal,
have no reason left at all to be optimistic.
You see, the goal is zero GHG emissions. Let's say we're on track to achieve that goal. One way to achieve that goal is the sensible way, and to do it voluntarily, using the scientific and technical resources at our disposal that can arguably even now deliver such an outcome. The other way to do it is what we're going to do, is that we're going to hold out to the last possible minute, and then there is going to be a catastrophic implosion. And then we're going to get to a sort of Mad Max outcome where there are very few greenhouse gas emissions, but that outcome will be achieved. So the question basically is that civilization can phase out fossil fuels, or it can be phased out by fossil fuels. And if civilization is phased out by fossil fuels, then fossil fuel emissions will naturally drop to zero. So we are on track for no GHG by 2100. The question is, how do we achieve it? So the Earth is going to be fine. From a longer ecological perspective, when this aberration of cancerous human growth on our planet has been contained by the very stupidity of that growth, the Earth will recover in 500,000 years, a million years. That's not a long time in the evolutionary, biological, geological sense. Human civilization is not it's not the Anthropocene, really. We're more of an event that is affecting the Earth.
No, we certainly
is headed
towards a blip on the radar screen. But you put a lot on the table, frankly. I mean, I can see Erum, and she'll have to grapple with a lot. But you didn't seem impressed at all, since it was on a lighter note, rather dark sort of lighter note. This was like the Davos in the Middle East. So at least you can say that growth is and modernity is coming to the global south also. But Erum, before I get to the specifics, I do want you to address some of the broader points that Ilhan has talked about. Now, two things have happened. And, one is, of course, the idea of growth, the way economists and the industry and the corporate sector talk about growth. So one obvious question is, what is the end point of this? I mean, like, for instance, how much money does an individual really need? I mean, we have people who, even if they were given 100 lifetimes, would not be able to spend the money that they've accumulated. So, I mean, and it would have been okay, but for the fact that there's a climate cost to that. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that we have become so accustomed to these conveniences, and there is obviously a paradox involved here. We become so accustomed to them that getting people to sort of dial back, if you will, or to downgrade is not only problematic, but also becomes a collective action problem.
So you've put lots of very interesting things on the table. They're obviously all complex, and we could all be here, like for days, months debating this, right? So I think what I hear from Ilhan, which is something which stands out at me, is that there is a clear lack of perhaps imagination and empathy, right? But I do also think at the same time that it is very simplistic to put this all on the doorstep of the global elites, which I think is what you're alluding to with what you're saying, right? That it is very, very difficult to get people to change their behavior or to change their aspirations. This is not just the Jeff Bezoses of the world, right? Yes, who can never spend his wealth. That's not what represents society, right? Any of us and people who aspire to better qualities of life, it is very difficult to get them to change their behavior. And that, by the way, is exactly what the so-called, I don't like these broad terms, Global South has been saying at least since the start of this COP process. If you see all of the statements that are being made, it says, and Africa takes a consistently, consistent position on this that is homogenous, where they say, you, the West, has developed using fossil fuels, and now you are trying to keep us from using our resources, which could be coal-fired plants, etc., from achieving the same level of quality of life for our people. And that is completely unjust. And that's where the concept of a just transition comes from. How do we try and give a better quality of life to everybody who is actually around on the planet and likely to come in a just way, without what Ilhan is saying, boiling the planet to a point where life itself becomes, in at least vast tracts of the planet, pretty uninhabitable, very, very difficult, right? So that is the challenge on the table. I actually think COP has many good processes, because I know that it's between governments, but if you go in and start looking at things that are signed, where people, organizations, NGOs, banks, other coalitions, everyone is there. So anyone, you and I could meet and, negotiate something and sign that and put it in the COP repository. Now, does that all have to be actualized? Does it have to be implemented? Absolutely, without any doubt. But it is very hard telling people that they don't deserve a decent quality of life. And that has no winning potential politically also. And I would submit that there's something, a very interesting strand of discussion going on about how now in Europe, where green parties are the most, advanced and developed, and they're also represented in the European Parliament. However, that their policies themselves are popular, but their ability to actually get elected and form political coalitions is very limited. So even in place, you think they're very committed to sort of green policies, they seem to not be able to develop a politics around, a green agenda. And that's a problem. If you look at what has the US done with Biden's election, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips Manufacturing Act, all of those are basically saying we are going to throw vast sums of money at the problem, and that will get us the green transition that we want. And of course, that goes to the double standard.
But at the same time, there has been more oil prospecting and drilling in the last 2.5 years of President Biden than there was perhaps during Trump's period.
I completely agree. And that's why I'm putting the political agenda and the political reality of how do you get to a change on the table, because you're absolutely right. Australia, which calls for green transition, is an emitting nation. The US is now the largest exporter of oil and gas in the world. 13.5 million barrels a day. I mean, that's a lot of prospecting and exporting. Why? Because geopolitics is in the way, right? So human beings, and as Ilhan points these things out in his book very well, respond to the politics of the moment. It's very hard to see ourselves through to a better, more moral world. And so we sort of muddle along. So, but these are the hard-nosed realities of the world. And that's what we have to try and work within, unfortunately. And that's why I say I am a realistic optimist, because there's no other way out of it.
I completely agree with you. I mean, when I wear a different cap, I call myself a structural realist, right? So, I do believe in doing what is doable, not just hankering after what is desirable. The problem here is that by most indicators, this is a race that we might already have lost. So the sense of urgency and trying to do what is not just desirable, but what is immediately desirable is something that requires a great sense of urgency. Now, I'll circle back to you. We still need to talk about the agriculture. I will also bring in the issue of water and the health fund. But there is another thing, Ilhan, which is a blind spot in all these negotiations. And that is the use by world's militaries of fossil fuels in terms of their exercises, in terms of their deployment, in terms of war fighting, in terms of a number of other activities. That particular aspect is not even on the table, has never been on the table.
Yes, and that basically shows you what the world's elites are interested in protecting. They want to preserve their ability to keep fighting wars for control of what is, unfortunately, at this stage, a dying planet. So, I keep telling, when I meet American or Chinese friends, I keep telling them, okay, look, please go ahead, have your Cold War, but please do so after you save the planet so that you have a planet to fight over. Because the way things were going, there's no geopolitics on Mars. You need people around, territory around, stuff worth having. The top 1% of people who, the top 1% of our income group by wealth, they're responsible for nearly a quarter of the increase in GHG emissions since 1990. And if you look at the disparity, the top 1% basically emit as much as the poorest 4 billion people on the planet. So one of the basic issues that I have is, and this is spelled out very well in a book by Anand Giridharadas, which is about winners take all, is that the idea of the win-win solution is one of the great lies of our present age, and indeed of earlier ages as well. What it basically posits is that there is a way to serve the interests of essentially irreconcilable groups. So there is a way to somehow save the interest of the slave owner and the slave at the same time. When history and sociology and philosophy would indicate that no, these are two irreconcilable interests, the slave wants freedom. If you give the slave freedom, he or she is no longer a slave and the slave owner is out of luck. So the problem over here is that we say that, the aspirations of the less developed countries. Let's talk a little bit about those aspirations, because what, again, history shows us is that way back in 2000, nearly a quarter of a century ago, global per capita income was about $8,500 US. That doesn't sound like much, of course, when you think about Scandinavia or, US or others, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 per capita incomes. But $8,000 per capita is more than enough to ensure every single human being a dignified existence, employment, housing, healthcare, the opportunity to develop their creative potential, that's more than enough for that. What has happened is that in order to deflect debate from redistribution, we have talked about growth, the idea that somehow a poor country with a per capita of, let's say, $200 in 1990 can grow its way to Denmark if only it allows Denmark to keep its existing structure and economic thing in place. But the problem is that in 2000, that was the first year that we had actually exceeded the planetary boundary. And every year since then, we have been mining the environment more and more intensely. When we talk about green growth, well, if we all switch over to the green growth model, we end up overshooting what our planet can sustain by a factor of 2. If we stick to the current model, we'll overshoot it by a factor of 5 by 2050. But the problem is, it doesn't really matter whether you overshoot something by 2 or 5, because that thing is going to collapse well before you get anywhere near it. So this is a fundamental issue that we have, and that is why I keep, harping on this point, that we appear to have actually reached an evolutionary endpoint. That is, there is a wall in front of us. We can comprehend at an intellectual level that we are headed straight into that wall at an accelerating pace, and we will soon all be going splat on it. But the structures that we have for governing ourselves, for actually acting to prevent us from going splat, they are all saying that, well, maybe if we slow the train down or we slow our movement down by 5% over 50 years, then maybe when we hit the wall, it won't be so rough after all. But once you're above a certain velocity, it doesn't really matter what velocity that is, because that is a velocity that's going to get everybody killed. So this is a fundamental problem that we are facing. And you see this problem on display when you talk about Davos, as you mentioned, when you talk about the Davos in the desert, or on the mountains perhaps next time, or in the jungle perhaps the time after that, or wherever. That is a fundamental problem that we are facing. And what is very interesting is that Middle Eastern countries, which are obviously oil-producing, energy-producing economies, they do have a very strong interest in keeping this thing going for longer, as do other Western countries, including the United States, including others, that are also increasing their exploration for hydrocarbons. So, we're saying and we're doing in equal and opposite directions in this respect.
But in fairness, the US, Norway, and I think one other country, they were actually supporting the phase-out demand at COP28. But Erum, your optimism is also facing this brick wall of Ilhan's pessimism, which obviously is something, to be very honest, I personally completely agree with. I mean, I have a slightly different take on that, which I will talk about briefly at the end of this program. But let's get to the specifics. Now, it's obviously important to recognize, for various reasons, that there is a nexus, an unfortunate nexus, between what's happening to the climate and what's happening to human bodies. And so, the health part of that comes in. But my question is that unless we begin to treat those issues which are causing these increased health problems, simply throwing money at the health fund without doing much about the rest of it is like, offering Panadol to a terminal patient.
Look, you're obviously right this is a holistic problem. What is happening to human bodies is what is happening to other species, is what is happening to the climate, resources, water, land, air quality, right? You name it. Absolutely. So we live on one planet and we have these distinct forms and features, and we're specific species, and, a tree is a tree and a human being is a human being. However, the tree is also impacted by things that the human being is impacted by. Okay, so we get that we are interconnected beings. But yet, for whatever it's worth, we work within these very specific political domains, right? That is the current reality of the world. Now, how do we move to making some of this work better for human beings and other species, etc.? And I think that's where it's important to focus. I think it is one of the things is, ADNOC, which is a major hydrocarbon producer, but at this COP28 also has been announced Altera, which the bank in the UAE will be leading, and it's a major green financing developed fund that is getting put together. And their idea is that they will have billions that they will unlock in financing, especially by 2030, because the time is running out. And that's key, and that's critical to everyone. Everybody realizes that we need to make these transitions very, very quickly. So I would like to get us to focus on, especially in Pakistan, on really what can Pakistan do to serve its people better and try and access a lot of this financing. I think that should be something that we should be working on at all levels of society. And not just, and again, now there's this whole idea of blended finance, right? So there's leveraging private sector, there is sort of like leveraging the public sector, etc., and mixing it. What Pakistan lacks, as we all know, is financial resiliency. And we just are always trying to access funds from outside. But for that, you need to do a lot of work. It's about fix your own home first, right? So for agriculture, with 40% at a minimum of our population reliant on some kind of an agricultural income, it's a huge sort of part of what we do as a nation. Can we, when the planet becomes more inhospitable for agriculture production, for instance, can we have something that is more sustainable, that gives farmers a livelihood, and that actually raises quality of life? I think that should be Pakistan's focus primarily. So we should be focused like a laser light on accessing finance for health, equity, systems. And I really mean that, because I think that the problems are increasing, money is coming in, and if we sort of sit on this, there are dozens of countries around the world who will go to the head of the line, and the funds will to run out. So a commitment is a commitment, but someone needs to start saying, you know what, I have something that we can show you that we can do with this. Give me the money to show it. I think we need to start demonstrating that success in our own domain. And that's when I think you'll unlock virtuous learning and virtuous examples for the world. Because guess what? Maybe we can change and we can be better. Because I think sort of like giving up and saying, oh, well, emissions are out of control, climate will warm by 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius, and we're all doomed. Maybe that putting that on the radar can be a way of clarifying serious minds and saying, look, unless we get serious, this is doom. And we are all doomed. And, people who have kids and grandkids, and everyone's going to be, facing this mess. So what do we do virtuously? And I think there's a lot we can do. I think the Pakistan State Bank can do a lot. Our banks should start moving. There is stuff to do today.
Okay, so here's the thing. Now, as far as awareness is concerned, as far as reports are concerned, at the very technical level also, hundreds of scientists across the broader discipline of science for decades have been warning of the direction in which we are headed. So it's not like we just sort of, kind of waking up to it, so to speak. The other thing is that the term green has now become the vogue. But whether we are actually looking at a policy structure holistically, about which you just, indicated, and I completely agree with you, whether that is something that we are prepared to do, or whether we have the capacity to do that, is moot. But I want to draw your attention to another very important aspect, which is also linked to, in a way, health also, and to agriculture also. And that is water. And you've done a lot of work on that, on the Indus Basin. Now, you're aware of the fact that for a number of reasons, for a number of geopolitical and interstate reasons, we are already getting into a very sort of bumpy stretch of the road as far as the Indus Water Treaty is concerned. The rivers are kind of drying up for various reasons. The glaciers have begun to melt. And all of this is going to not only have impact on agriculture, but could also have a very negative impact on India-Pakistan relations, for instance. So there are a number of things kind of which are linked up. And the picture doesn't appear to me to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Good.
So the geopolitics of water are absolutely complex, and on a warming planet, they're going to get worse. So if you think the Indus is bad, if you go look at the politics of the Mekong, for instance, or the politics of the Nile, for instance, right? These are absolutely similar problems. I mean, on the Mekong, similarly, it's the Himalayan glaciers, and we have a massive problem. So you're absolutely right. These are livelihoods depend on these river systems functioning, which is why it is absolutely necessary that we work in a concerted way to make sure that they continue to function. However, you must plan for something to work, but also plan for what if it doesn't work, right?
Correct.
So what if the rivers start drying out? What if downstream impacts? And as you're saying, I mean, if you go down to see the Indus Delta now, today, you will see that it is dry. There are no fish. So it is already a mess. So you're right. It's not like something that will happen. It is the present that is a debacle and a disaster. So what we, I think, need to do, seeing that this crisis actually here, we need to start thinking, how can we do what we do in a way that innovates out of this? So if you look at the Dutch model of farming, for instance, I mean, could anybody imagine that a place as tiny as the Netherlands is the largest exporter of food items in the world? And that's crazy because it's up against places like Russia and China and the US. But the Dutch have decided that, look, we need to do agriculture in a different way. So I really think that we need to be trying to make the Indus Waters Treaty work. However, glaciers are melting, warming is a fact of life. So the Indus will not continue to behave as it has behaved over the last century. And then what are we going to do? We will have half a billion people, and we need to feed them and perhaps even export to the world. So we need to start transitioning. And that's what I want to put on the table. We must immediately take these threats seriously to start thinking we cannot, business as usual is not, a fact that will continue.
Right. So are you, specifically talking about drip technology? How are we going to manage this?
So drip technology is also has deep problematic issues because it's not that easy and there's a lot of maintenance issues. It's more expensive. So there's a lot of, within sort of greenhouses that agriculture has to happen. There is a lot of innovation that has to happen. So, if I were a Pakistani policymaker, I would sit down and I would start pumping in massive amounts of money into our agricultural universities. And I think, look, we need seed technology to develop. We need methods to change. We need to develop the knowledge base and profile of our farmers and our farmers' capacity. It's unfortunately this kind of work, it's like really the non-sexy work, right? It's boring, it takes work, you need to do it in labs, but that's what you need to cope with what we are faced with.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I completely agree with you. You've got to begin to think hard about these things and actually put some policy structures in place and start R&D and the rest of it. And, you've got to take this seriously. I mean, in the sense that we have already done a lot of work in terms of advocacy and the rest of it in relation to climate over the last 2 years, 3 years. And I think we have been fairly, in terms of our salience, we've been pretty sharp on the international stage, but there's a lot of work that we need to do at home also. Now, Ilhan, I want to close this program also. So some final thoughts in terms of what can possibly be done. I mean, you have explained to us very elaborately and lucidly the challenges that we face. In fact, the disaster that we're staring at. But what is it that we can do in trying to sort of, let's say, reduce the velocity of the train to manageable levels?
I think what is really unfortunate about climate change and global warming, global heating, is that the science behind it was understood for decades. The projections were remarkably accurate. What needed to be done in order to avoid a mid-century, mid-21st century industrial collapse were also pretty clear. So the issue is that there is a lot that we can do, and there is a lot of things that we should have done a lot earlier. And even if we do them now, we can at least mitigate the outcomes. But that brick wall I talked about earlier is something which exercises such a magnetic hold on those that are in charge of our train that they seem determined to try to smash right through it. So, for instance, recently, Elon Musk was talking to the New York Times, at which he basically told various advertisers very politely what he thought about them. But one of the interesting things that he said was, though I am not at all a Musk fan, was that, you can violate a lot of laws, but you can't violate the laws of physics. And what we're trying to do is that we're trying to violate the laws of physics. And that's not going to work because those laws are very, very exact and they always set in. So when we come to what we can do, of course, there's so much that, theoretically we can lay out. I mean, right now, for instance, I'm an advocate of what I would call a G2 process. I believe that China and the United States, between the two of them, forget everybody else, just these two countries, actually have the scientific, technical, and economic wherewithal to substantially slow down our movement towards this worst outcome. The collapse of China's river systems is the end of Chinese civilization. China is the water kingdom, the original water kingdom in Asia. The collapse of the Indus Basin is the end of Pakistan and maybe much of northern India. The collapse of the American river systems is the end of the United States, and so on and so forth. So these are state-ending, civilization-ending crises. They are crises that merit an emergency response. What type of emergency response? Well, how did governments respond to fighting World War II? They imposed rationing. They imposed labor discipline. they diverted scientific and technical resources to defeating the adversary, which in that case, of course, happened to be the Axis powers. They essentially did whatever they had to do, borrowing, rising up debt, not worrying about the finances or whatever, in order to achieve the strategic outcome that would allow a kind of human civilization to survive. So
you're basically saying that
that is the type of response that you need to happen.
So absolute
but that is not
footing.
That is what is needed.
Yeah, right. So there's got to be a response that's on war footing, or someone being stretched into ER and was about to expire if not treated immediately.
And I believe, just as during World War II, the United States eventually got its act together, the United States and China today, between the two of them, can actually do it and basically drag the rest of the world kicking and screaming with them if necessary. Because if they don't do it, there's no world left for everyone, including them.
Any final quick thoughts, Erum?
On that, I think we can agree. I really do believe that this is an all of society approach that we need to sort of take. And you know how the Oscar-winning film was everything everywhere all at once this time? I think that's perhaps the way to approach this problem, that we actually really need to take that kind of approach. That yes, it is everything everywhere all at once, and that's how we need to work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been a lovely discussion, dark. And I'm happy that Erum was here because, I know Ilhan's view is dark. Mine is sometimes even darker than Ilhan's. So we needed Erum's optimism and light to shine upon Ilhan's and mine darkness. But here's the thing. I've always maintained that our lives individually and collectively are governed by the paradox. So the whole idea of progress is something in which regression inheres in that idea. So every time we think that we're progressing, we are also creating situations for ourselves which are likely to be setbacks. And, the whole idea of industrial revolution and the way we've grown and the way we have mined the planet's resources and the way we have depleted those resources. And now, of course, nature was smiling at us all the time, now prepared to strike back at us. But let's hope that we manage somehow. I'm also not, frankly, too optimistic about people who think that at the end of the day, we might be able to find some kind of technical or technological solution to these problems. But let's hope. Considering that I have a granddaughter that I love, I certainly want her and the younger generation to enjoy the planet and its resources. But let's see. Let's hope that at the end of the day, Erum's optimism prevails over our pessimism. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.